Hello, hello, welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse. And before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British Rail critics, and my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains preserved. And today we are going to discuss the preservation movement when it comes to rail history. It's something that many rail fans in general are quite familiar with, since if the preservation movement didn't exist, a lot of heritage railways just wouldn't exist. And the interesting thing about the preservation movement is there was a time before it was really a thing, and it took losing quite a lot of history when it comes to the railroads for people to start wanting to fix that. So let's discuss how the death of steam started the preservation movement. It seems strange to say it now, as with the way people are about railroads these days, especially those really into trains, like rail fans or, God help you, foamers, it's almost expected that at least one member of a particular type of class of locomotive will be preserved somehow. I mean, generally speaking, over here in America, Amtrak, whenever they retire a locomotive, will usually donate at least one or two members of the class to some kind of museum somewhere. But it wasn't so long ago where that was absolutely not a given. Many classes of locomotive, especially during the steam age, were simply, lost. Gone. They were sent to the scrap and they were replaced with another steam engine, a more modern one. There are many historical classes of locomotives that are simply extinct. They no longer exist. But that was accepted because it wasn't really that much of a change. It's true, we were losing particular classes of locomotive, but back then, rail fanning wasn't really much of a thing, at least not the way it is now, and people still expected to see another steam locomotive. I mean, there were particular classes that people got attached to, especially the engineers that actually worked on the locomotives themselves. But back in the early 1900s, unless a locomotive was involved in a very specific incident of historical value, like the General and the Texas, or perhaps was a record-breaking locomotive, like the Mallard, the idea of preserving them wasn't even really a thing. Museums had no reason to have a bunch of ancient locomotives kicking around, especially if they weren't attached to anything of real historical value, because the individual locomotives at that time weren't seen as intrinsically valuable. But that would all start to change in the 1940s and the 1950s. And for our purposes, I'm going to focus on the United States and the United Kingdom, as the preservation movement is actually well documented in these particular countries, but understand that this would start to become a worldwide phenomenon that would affect many, many, many countries. What was the big deal? Why were suddenly people starting to care that these steam engines were being sent to scrap? Well, that's because they were no longer being replaced by more steam engines. They were being replaced by the new, modern, sleek diesel units. Suddenly, things were actually genuinely changing. Trains and steam locomotives in general had become an intrinsic part of world culture. They had been there for a century, and suddenly, every railroad was getting rid of them. They were just gone, replaced with these fancy new diesels. And the press at the time was, of course, trying to talk up the diesels as the future, the way forward, it's all going to be great, better, wonderful, and there's nothing inherently wrong with diesels, of course, I want to stress that. Plenty of rail fans love diesels, too. But the issue at the time especially was that the steam engines were being called old, obsolete, meaningless, and were being effectively thrown away. And suddenly, the lines just weren't the same. Yeah, the E units and the F units, whatever British Rail was doing, who knows, were cool and all, and they could definitely do the job the steam engines did, but there was no longer the familiar sound of a train. Diesels sounded different, they looked different, they behaved different. It wasn't the same. And I don't know if this is news to anybody, but a lot of people really hate the living crap out of change. So much. It's something that is violently resisted, but there was only so much anybody could do for a while. After all, the average person doesn't have room for a steam engine in their backyard. What were they gonna do? For a time, it was nothing. In the UK alone, under British Rail, as a part of their 1955 modernization plan, they pushed to scrap over 16,000 steam locomotives. Unceremoniously, and without even an intent of submitting any of them for preservation. And over in America, New York Central's then president, Alfred E. Perlman, hated the notion of preservation, as he felt that having any steam locomotives attached to New York Central, whether they were in a museum or not, would make his company look old, and he directly ordered the scrapping of hundreds of steam locomotives, several of which, like the Niagaras and the famous Hudsons, were rendered extinct by this action. Although things looked bleak, hope wasn't lost. In fact, it would be found in the story of a narrow-gauge railroad over in the UK. The Tawelyn Railway was a small line in Wales that had operated since 1865, but by the 40s it was on the downslope and would likely have closed. However, it remained open due to the actions of several men and volunteers that teamed up to run the line as a tourist attraction. And in 1951, it became the first railway in the world to be considered preserved as a heritage railway. It was a new thing. Tawelyn would actually inspire the fictional Skarloey Railway as part of the Thomas the Tank Engine series by Reverend W. Awdry, who actually volunteered at the railway himself. Some of his stories were based off of things he experienced while working there. But what the people at Tawelyn did was not just save that line, but prove that heritage railways could be a thing. Suddenly people realized that plenty of other lines could be saved if enough people got together to invest in these tourist spots. And if there were heritage railways, there was suddenly extra space for preserving steam locomotives. Heritage railways began popping up all over the place, in both America and the UK, as well as the rest of the world. Some of these railways often had existing rolling stock to be used for their tourist lines, but people also started making it a point to try to save other types of locomotives before they could be put to the cutter's torch. In the privatized networks of America at the time, New York Central fortunately proved to be the exception when it came to preservation, as many other rail networks fully embraced the notion of saving at least one of their last steam engines. Union Pacific is likely the best example of this, as not only did they choose to donate plenty of their retiring rolling stock to various museums and railways, but they also kept one of their steamers, the FEF-3 844, in active service, and she still is today. The heritage lines were proving to be quite successful, and rail fanning as a whole began to take off. Suddenly people were more about saving the existing steam locomotives, and even though the press kept talking up the diesels, yeah, they were nice, but don't get rid of our steam engines was plenty of people's attitude. Employees of the railways especially were vocal about this because they had worked with and bonded with some of these vehicles. There's stories on multiple lines, New York Central in particular, of workmen intentionally hiding locomotives specifically to keep them from being put to the cutter's torch. There's not actually verifiable evidence of how often this happened, though there may be some truth to it, but I personally can't stop imagining Alfred E. Perlman himself coming down from his office with a hacksaw trying to find the last steam locomotive in his yards, only to have the workmen constantly feign ignorance. Boys, where on earth is that last steam engine? I cannot have my rail line being seen as old! I don't know, boss. It was here, and it's just gone. It happens sometimes. Steam engines are very notorious for, turning invisible. It happens, we'll look for it, though. We'll find it. Well, you better find it. I, for one, cannot possibly tolerate the notion of any steam engine associated with my rail line remaining on this plane of existence. Yeah, we'll definitely find it sometime, eventually, in a few years or so. Isn't that right, Barry? Yeah, I don't even know what a steam engine is. Sure you do, Barry. Let's not go that far with it. I want that steam engine. Righto, just do me a favor, boss. Just don't look in the back of the work shed under the sheet. Ever again. Eternally. Please, don't do that. But over in the United Kingdom, where things were under the control of British Rail, which is a government entity, things were a lot more complicated. Whereas a private rail company has to worry about its image, and many companies in the United States found it good for public relations that they would intentionally save or donate some of their locomotives, British Rail just didn't have to worry about PR that much. I mean, technically they did, but they were government owned. And maybe this is a hot take, but let's be fair about this. How much does the government really care about what the general public thinks? I'm just saying. As a result, they weren't held very accountable and were going full tilt into their modernization plan, which saw fit to completely destroy pretty much all their steam engines and replace it with fancy new diesels that they had bought just so many of. Many of the steam locomotives were actually in perfect working order and even went under their own power to the scrapyards. Some people appealed to British Rail themselves to try to buy the locomotives outright, as was the case with the Flying Scotsman, who would have been scrapped otherwise, but British Rail was notoriously difficult to negotiate with on this matter. You had to go through a weird legal process and bureaucracy. They wouldn't just sell the locomotives outright. And even if the locomotives got to the scrapyards, the contracts they had all the scrappers sign said that they would have to pay them a fee if the locomotive wasn't scrapped, because the only reason they were sold at the scrapyards was so the locomotive could be scrapped. It was insane. But interestingly, many locomotives wound up preserved due to a specific scrapyard in the UK. The Woodham Brothers scrapyard wound up getting over 200 steam locomotives, as well as a whole bunch of other rolling stock. The thing was, the Woodham Brothers found that it was actually more profitable for them if they focused on scrapping the cars rather than the locomotives, which took more time to break down. As a result of this, many locomotives simply sat at their yards for years, and it didn't take long for preservationists scrambling to try to save as many steam locomotives as they could to get wise to this. The Woodham Brothers proved to be willing to negotiate with preservationists and sell the locomotives to them so long as they secured transportation, as well as paid the locomotive's scrap value, plus the levy that had to be paid to British Rail if the locomotive wasn't scrapped. British Rail, for their part, as long as they were getting their money out of it, didn't really pay this issue any mind. They had other things to focus on in the 60s. Okay, so we're just calling this a Clayton Type 1. This is just kind of a rough draft of what we want the diesel to look like. We'll take all of them! All of them? We haven't even built any yet. It's just a drawing. No, we would like all of them. All of them! How many is all to you? How many can you make for all these tax dollars? 117. Done! A total of 213 locomotives were rescued from the Woodham Brothers scrapyard, and some are even in operation today. It was a tremendous victory for the preservation movement, and the thing about the preservation movement, plus the sudden existence of heritage railways, is that it paved the way for a new standard when it came to preserving rolling stock. The death of steam wound up saving a lot of future locomotive types. Diesels and electric locomotives would benefit from their loss because suddenly, whenever the new, sleek diesels were suddenly no longer new and sleek and were replaced, later generations would suddenly simply expect, a few of them at least, to be preserved and donated to museums, as many railway companies, private or otherwise, do right now. It was through the efforts of thousands of people that desperately didn't want to see these pieces of human history, living history, die. And even though we've lost plenty of locomotive types that we can mourn for years, think about how many we've managed to save. If the powers that be had had their way back then, there wouldn't be a single steam locomotive running in 2022. And yet, there's still plenty. Some even on the main lines. And that's a win in my book. And with that, a special thank you goes out to my underwater train finders, Thomas Ward, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Some Dude 267, Brightline Blue, Joshua Long, Ohio Trucker 1, Royal Hudson 2860, Lord Hoth 444, Arthur Roy, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Mr. Black Rose, Tribal Typhoon, Dark Lightning 1536, and Master of None. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.